Boston, late autumn. The streets around Tremont were slick with rain, reflecting the pale morning light in fractured ripples. Inside the Bean and Anchor Cafe, the windows were beaded with droplets that distorted the view of hurried pedestrians under umbrellas. The air was warm, heavy with the mingled scents of espresso, steamed milk, and the sharp tang of wet asphalt that drifted in whenever the door opened. Grace Mitchell had been on her feet since dawn, moving between tables with the steady rhythm of someone who knew the morning rush was only just beginning. She wore her hair pulled back in a loose knot, a pencil tucked behind her ear, and the sleeves of her uniform rolled to the elbows. Every now and then she'd glance up at the big windows, watching the rain run in slow streams, a moving backdrop to the clink of cups and the low murmur of conversation. The bell over the door gave a tired chime and a gust of cold air slipped in with the man who entered. He was in his early 50s, maybe older, with a face lined in ways that spoke more of long days than years. His coat was worn thin at the elbows, the collar darkened with damp. The boots on his feet had seen better decades, the leather cracked and softened from miles of use. He paused just inside, scanning the menu board as though weighing each item against something unseen, then stepped toward the counter. His voice was low, nearly swallowed by the hum of the espresso machine as he asked for a black coffee. The barista on shift, Tyler, a young man with a sharp jawline and an expression that always seemed to be halfway to a smirk, rang it up without looking at him. The man patted at his coat pockets, then checked again more urgently. His brow creased. His fingers searched the lining, then the inside of his shirt pocket before stopping entirely. "I must have left my wallet at home," he said, his voice carrying the quiet embarrassment of someone not accustomed to asking for favors. "If it's all right, could I just—" He didn't get far. Tyler's smirk sharpened, his tone carrying more volume than necessary. "This isn't a shelter, sir. If you can't pay, you can't stay." A few heads turned. The nearest customers shifted in their seats, curiosity stirring. The man straightened slightly, his cheeks coloring. "I wasn't asking for a free drink," he said, but his voice had gone smaller. "Just somewhere dry for a bit." From a corner table, a pair of well-dressed men exchanged glances, one leaning toward the other with a snort of laughter. "Imagine that, comes in with nothing and expects to be served," one said under his breath, loud enough for the words to travel. A woman at another table gave a low chuckle, murmuring something about people having no shame these days. The words landed like pebbles dropped in still water, each ripple adding to the man's discomfort. He began to turn toward the door, the weight of the moment pulling his shoulders down. Grace had been watching. From her station near the far end of the counter, she saw the scene in full. The damp coat, the hesitance in his step, the way his eyes didn't dart around the cafe like a schemer's but stayed fixed on the floor as though bracing for impact. Something old stirred in her memory. She was 15 again, standing in the crowded aisle of a market with her mother collapsed at her feet, people flowing around them like water around a stone. Only one person had stopped. An elderly woman in a patched wool skirt who knelt, offered water, and wrapped a fraying shawl around Grace's trembling shoulders. Grace had never forgotten the way that moment had cut through the cold. She set down the tray she'd been carrying with a faint clatter that made Tyler glance her way. Sliding a hand into the pocket of her apron, she pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and placed it firmly on the counter. "Black coffee," she told Tyler, her voice steady but carrying, "for the gentleman by the door." Tyler blinked. "Grace, you don't have to." She met his gaze until he stopped. "I'm paying for it," she said simply. "Out of my own pocket." The hum of conversation had quieted. She let her eyes travel over the room, not angrily, but with a kind of unflinching steadiness. "It costs nothing to show someone dignity," she said, and her tone carried no sermon, only fact. "It's not a transaction. But mocking someone when they're down, now that's cheap." Tyler broke eye contact first, ringing up the order in silence. The man hesitated before stepping forward to accept the cup. Grace gestured toward the window. "Seats free," she said. "Best view in the place." He nodded once, a flicker of something, gratitude or maybe relief, passing through his expression, and moved to the corner table. Outside, the rain traced slow paths down the glass, the city beyond blurring into softened shapes and muted colors. He wrapped his hands around the cup as if drawing in its warmth, his gaze settling not on the people around him but on the street outside. Grace returned to her work, but she caught herself glancing toward him more than once. There was something deliberate in the way he sat there, as though he were not just passing time but taking measure of it. And though she had no reason to think so, she had the distinct impression that she had just stepped into a story that was far from over. The morning after the rain-soaked encounter, Grace had barely tied her apron when the call came over the intercom. Grace's office. Her manager's voice carried no warmth. She wiped her hands on a towel and made her way past the counter, feeling the eyes of a few early customers follow her. The office was a narrow, windowless room in the back of the cafe, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the faint tang of bleach from the mop bucket in the corner. Mark, her manager, sat behind the desk, arms folded, jaw set. He didn't waste time. He said her little scene with the drifter yesterday had embarrassed her coworker and made customers uncomfortable. Grace started to respond, but he held up a hand. You're here to serve, not to make speeches. This isn't about charity, it's about policy. She reminded him quietly that she'd paid for the coffee herself. That's not the point, he replied. You put this place in the middle of a spectacle. Don't do it again. When she stepped back into the main room, the chatter of the break room was louder than usual. Two of her co-workers, Brittany and Kyle, leaned against the counter, their voices pitched just high enough to carry. Brittany said she'd heard Grace was hoping for some grand romantic gesture. Maybe the man would whisk her away for saving him. Kyle laughed, suggesting maybe she thought he'd tip her $100. They didn't look at her when she passed, but they didn't have to. The weight of their smirks followed her out. Grace didn't answer. She'd learned a long time ago that answering only gave people something to push against. That evening, she climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment she shared with her younger sister, Clara. The building smelled faintly of cooking oil and damp wood. Inside, the living room was dim, a second-hand lamp casting a yellow glow over the threadbare couch where Clara lay propped up by pillows, a blanket pulled to her chin. Her cheeks were pale, her breath still carrying the faint rasp of someone not entirely free from illness. You're late, Clara murmured with a small smile. Grace shrugged, slipping off her shoes. Long day. They ate a simple dinner, 2 bowls of reheated vegetable soup and a few slices of bread that had gone just a little stale. Grace glanced at the small ceramic bowl on the counter where she kept loose bills and coins. After rent and utilities there wasn't much left. She counted what remained, $12 in singles, a few coins and her transit pass. It would have to stretch until payday. Her thoughts drifted back to years ago when she'd first taken the job at Bean and Anchor. She had been 19, full of plans to study literature, maybe even teach. But when their father left and medical bills began piling up after their mother's illness, Grace had traded lecture halls for double shifts, swapping textbooks for coffee trays. Clara had been just starting college then. Grace told her to stay in school, that she'd take care of things until the storm passed. The storm never really did, but Grace never let her sister feel the full weight of it. 4 days passed before she saw the man again. It was a busy afternoon, the air in the cafe thick with the hiss of steaming milk and the murmur of conversations competing with clinking silverware. Grace was clearing a table near the window when the door opened and a draft swept in. She glanced up and felt a small jolt of recognition. He looked different now, no frayed coat, no worn boots. Instead, he wore a dark wool overcoat, the shoulders sharp and well-fitted, a charcoal scarf looped neatly at his neck. His shoes gleamed as if they'd been polished that morning. Without glancing at the counter, he walked straight to the same seat he had occupied that rainy morning, the one by the window. He settled in, hands resting lightly on the table, and after a moment, his eyes found hers. He gave a slight nod, just enough to call her over. Grace hesitated, then crossed the room. Before she could speak, he asked, "Why did you help me that day?" His voice was even, but there was a curiosity in it that felt heavier than the words themselves. Grace met his gaze and considered how much to say. She told him about that day in the market years ago, about the stranger who had been the only one to stop when everyone else kept moving. She said she had promised herself, right then, that if she ever had the chance to be that person for someone else, she would take it, without weighing whether they deserved it, without thinking of what it might cost. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod in approval or offer polite affirmations. He simply listened, his eyes steady as though committing each word to memory. When she finished, he sat in silence for a moment, then rose. "I might see you again," he said, not as a promise or a threat, but as a simple possibility. Without ordering, without explaining himself further, he left, the bell above the door giving a short, final chime in his wake. Grace stood for a moment in the soft hum of the cafe, feeling as if something had shifted, though she couldn't yet name what it was. A week passed without seeing him again, the days blurring into the familiar cycle of morning rushes and evening cleanups. Then, late one afternoon, Grace found an envelope wedged between the folds of the day's mail on the kitchen table. Her name was pressed into the paper in raised, careful lettering, and the thick cardstock felt foreign in her hands. She turned it over twice before sliding a finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single card, the ink deep and deliberate, An invitation to the Caldwell House, a private historic hotel in Boston's Beacon Hill district. It gave a date and time for a conversation, and was signed simply, Edward Caldwell. There was no explanation, no return address, only the faint scent of expensive paper and a gold-embossed crest at the top that seemed to belong to another world entirely. She stared at it for a long time. Every instinct told her it wasn't her place, that she'd have nothing to say in a marble hall to a man who, judging by the formality, lived far outside her orbit. But when Clara came in from the bedroom, hair damp from a shower, and saw the card on the table, she raised an eyebrow. "You're going," she said with the quiet certainty of someone used to reading her sister's hesitation. Grace laughed it off at first, pointing out the absurdity of her showing up in a place like that. Clara just shrugged. If he went to the trouble to send it, he must have a reason. You'll regret it if you don't at least find out. 3 days later, Grace stood outside the grand entrance of Caldwell House, the early evening air biting at her cheeks. She had borrowed a pair of black pumps from a neighbor, a half-size too big, and paired them with her best skirt and a blouse she hadn't worn in years. Her hair was pinned back, though a few loose strands refused to stay in place. The doorman opened the tall brass-framed doors without question, and the sudden warmth of the lobby wrapped around her. She felt the give of plush carpet beneath her feet, saw the sweep of a staircase curling upward like something from a film, and heard the faint echo of her own steps under the marble dome. The concierge, immaculate in a dark suit, checked the card she presented and directed her to a private room off the main floor. The walls there were paneled in dark wood, the lighting low but warm, and a long window framed the early evening city lights. Grace was still taking in the quiet elegance when the door opened. Edward Caldwell stepped inside. This time there was no worn coat, no softened boots, only a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a silk tie in muted blue, and the calm authority of someone used to commanding attention without asking for it. 2 assistants trailed behind, carrying folders, but with a subtle gesture he dismissed them, and they retreated silently. "Grace," he said, his voice smooth but unforced. "Thank you for coming." She tried to match his composure but felt her pulse in her throat. "This isn't exactly the Bean and Anchor," she managed, a hint of a smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. He gestured to a pair of chairs near the window, already set with tea and coffee service. They sat, and for a moment the quiet between them seemed to stretch, filled only by the faint sound of traffic far below. "I wasn't pretending to be someone else that morning," he began, leaning back slightly. "I was traveling light. I found that when there's nothing obvious to gain, people show you who they really are." He spoke plainly, without the grand pauses or theatrical delivery she half expected. He went on to tell her that his wife had died 15 years ago, sudden, unexpected, and that they'd never had children. In the years since, he had traveled not for leisure, but to visit towns and neighborhoods without announcing who he was. He said he wanted to see where kindness still lived, unprompted, unpurchased. Grace listened, a tightness building in her chest. Part of her was honored that he'd sought her out. Another part bristled at the thought of being part of some unspoken experiment. "So," she said slowly, "was I being tested?" His eyes met hers, steady but unreadable. "No," he said. "I didn't approach you. I didn't ask you for anything. You made your own choice." The answer didn't entirely settle her. She felt as though she stood on the edge of something she couldn't yet see clearly, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. But before she could find another question, he leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table. "I'm not here to offer you anything," he said, "except perhaps another cup of coffee, no promises, no pretense. Just conversation if you'd want that." She studied him for a long moment, hearing in his tone no trace of obligation, only a curious sincerity. Outside the window, the lights of Boston flickered against the darkening sky, and she found herself wondering not why he had invited her here, but why, against her better judgment, she was tempted to say yes. Over the next several months, Grace found herself on trains, in the passenger seats of old cars, and walking down narrow sidewalks in towns she'd never have visited on her own. Edward's invitations were never extravagant. He didn't speak of trips so much as errands or detours, yet each one took them farther from Boston and deeper into corners of the country where life moved at a different rhythm. In Vermont, they ate breakfast in a diner where the waitress called every customer Han, and the coffee came in chipped mugs that never seemed to empty. Edward asked about the owner's father, and she answered without a flicker of surprise, as if she'd known him for years. In Maine, they stood on the weathered boards of a fishing dock, watching gulls circle as men in wool caps unloaded crates heavy with the day's catch. Edward spoke with the dockmaster about repairs to the pier, listening more than talking, his hands tucked into the pockets of a coat that had clearly seen salt air before. In Ohio, they stopped at a community center that smelled faintly of laundry soap and soup. Edward greeted the director by name, and they spent the afternoon stacking boxes of donated winter clothes. Grace noticed no one treated him like a benefactor or a guest of honor. He was simply Ed, someone who showed up and carried his share. Now and then, someone would look twice at him, recognition dawning, but it was never followed by the awe or guardedness Grace might have expected if they knew his wealth. Instead, the response was warmth, an old friend stopping by, not a figure to be handled with care. Grace began to understand that this was deliberate. He wasn't hiding so much as stepping into a version of himself that the wider world rarely saw. One afternoon, they visited a veteran's home tucked at the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. The building was modest, with an American flag out front and a small garden kept by the residents. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of baking bread. Grace watched Edward sink into a chair across from a man with a faded Marine Corps tattoo, and the two began talking, not in the broad strokes of ceremony, but in the slow, meandering pace of shared memory. Edward didn't rush the conversation or turn it toward himself. He asked about the man's service, his hometown, the dog he had as a boy. Hours passed this way, Edward moving from one table to another, never making speeches, never offering platitudes, just listening with a patience that made the room feel lighter. It was after they left, walking toward the car under a sky streaked with the last colors of sunset, that Grace asked why he avoided telling people who he really was. He glanced at her, the ghost of a smile on his face. Because people stop telling the truth when they think you can fix their lives with a pen stroke, he said. I'd rather hear what's real. She thought about that as they drove, the road unspooling ahead, the headlights catching the edges of winter bare trees. The closest they came to something like a vacation was a week in Maine, staying in a small cabin not far from the coast. The nights there were quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the pines and the distant hiss of waves on rock. One evening they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, a single lantern casting a warm circle of light between them. Edward was uncharacteristically still, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the treeline. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. I'm not looking for romance, he said, as if wanting to make sure the air between them stayed honest. What I need is someone who understands why I love the things I do. Someone who doesn't need to be dazzled, just present. Grace let the words hang in the air before answering. She admitted she wasn't sure she fully understood him. His choices, his guarded way of moving through the world, still carried a kind of mystery she couldn't quite unpack. But she also told him she'd never felt more like herself than she did in his company. There was no need to pretend, no expectation to impress or perform. She said it quietly, without flourish, and he didn't reply with thanks or sentiment. He just looked at her, the corners of his eyes softening, and nodded once as if to say that was enough. The night around them deepened, the stars sharpening against the dark, and the steady rhythm of the waves below filled the silence that followed. 3 months after their night on the porch in Maine, the air in Boston carried the first bite of spring when Edward asked to meet her on the rooftop terrace of a converted church overlooking the city. The evening light spilled gold across the skyline, catching in the glass of new high-rises and the weathered stone of older buildings. He carried a simple leather folder worn at the edges. Without much preamble, he slid it across the table to her. Inside were legal documents to establish a foundation in her name, the Grace Mitchell Opportunity Fund. It was all there: initial endowment, mission statement, projected partnerships. She read in silence, aware of the weight of what she was holding. Edward explained he wanted it to exist because one person choosing to see someone without conditions deserved to echo far beyond that single act. Grace kept her hands on the folder for a moment before closing it gently. She told him she was honored, more than she could put into words, but she wanted to build something of her own. Not because she didn't value what he was offering, but because someone had once believed in her enough to let her believe in herself. She wanted to pass that same belief forward, not with money alone, but with presence and action. He didn't try to persuade her otherwise. They sat there for a while longer, talking about nothing in particular, until the city lights came on one by one. When they parted, there were no promises, no dramatic goodbyes, only the quiet certainty that whatever paths they took, they left carrying something of the other. The months that followed were steady and unglamorous. Grace walked the streets of her neighborhood with a notebook, making calls, asking questions, following up on leads for an empty space she could afford. She found it in the form of a shuttered cafe on the corner of an older brick building, its windows clouded with dust, the inside stripped to bare floors and forgotten counters. It took all her savings, the help of a few friends, and more than one late-night burst of stubborn resolve to bring it back to life. She painted the walls herself, refinished the tables from a salvage yard, and filled the shelves with donated books and mismatched mugs. When the sign finally went up, it read Harbor Light Cafe in clean, simple letters. Beneath the name etched into the glass was a motto she had carried in her mind for years: no one should have to earn kindness. On opening day, the air inside hummed with low conversation and the warm scent of fresh coffee. Friends from the neighborhood mixed with curious passers-by. A young barista named Nate worked the counter, nervously wiping it between orders. Rain began to patter against the windows halfway through the morning, blurring the view of the street outside. That was when the door opened and an older man stepped in. His coat was soaked through, his shoes leaving small puddles on the floor. He hesitated just past the threshold, eyes flicking toward the counter as though expecting to be told to leave. Nate started toward him, the polite but firm tone of a gatekeeper in his voice. "Sir, this place is for customers only, so if you don't..." Grace was already moving. She placed a hand on Nate's shoulder, light but certain. "It's all right," she said, then turned to the man. "Would you like a seat by the window?" He nodded, relief softening the lines of his face. "What would you like today?" she asked. "Just something warm," he murmured. "To sit for a bit, it's been a long morning." Grace smiled. "Then let's make it longer with a little peace. The first cup's on us. No questions, no shame." Nate's eyes widened slightly, the lesson landing without another word. As she moved back toward the counter, something in the rain-streaked window caught her attention. Across the street, under a black umbrella, Edward stood watching. His coat collar was turned up, his face calm, eyes warm. He didn't wave or signal. He simply nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, before turning and disappearing into the rain. She felt no sting at his leaving, only the quiet recognition of a full circle drawn. Later that afternoon, Grace stood near the small piano in the corner, holding a warm cup in her hands as she addressed the guests. She told them about a rainy day years ago, when she had paid $5 for a stranger's coffee. She didn't give names, only the truth of the moment, that she had seen someone being made small and couldn't stand by. "Kindness isn't a transaction," she said, her voice carrying easily in the intimate space. "It's not something people should have to earn. That cup cost me $5, but it gave me a new way to see the world." Some in the crowd nodded, others smiled faintly. "This cafe," she continued, "isn't just about coffee. It's about showing up when no one else does." She took a sip, then set the cup down with a soft clink. "A man once told me, kindness doesn't need to be remembered, it only needs to be continued. So that's what we're doing here. One cup at a time." The room filled with applause, a saxophone began to play softly from a corner, and somewhere near the counter, Nate poured a first cup for another stranger who hadn't known they needed it until they did. And just like that, the cycle began again, quiet and unassuming, the way all enduring things do. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.